Hello all, it's your girl Tiffany, Madam Luscious Black Beauty, your Poetic Psychic Pisces HighPriestess, aka the light that shines like a diamond, also known as your modern day nun, one whom isn't within a coven, a convent, or a covenant. I do thank you all for listening and for watching on tonight. If you would be so kind to like, share, and subscribe, it would be greatly appreciated. This is going to be another one of my story times with yours truly, Poetic Psychic Pisces HighPriestess. I do thank you all for listening and for watching. So if you'll be so kind to like, share, and subscribe, it will be greatly appreciated, guys. Tonight's story time is entitled Twin Towers, okay? So, of course, as always, this is all original work by yours truly. As you can see here, all 77 pages, okay, of my original work, which I always like to share with you all, okay? Also, brief disclaimer, guys, okay? No person, place, or thing spake about in the story particularly speaks of anyone specifically, okay? So I always like that to be known because I know how people's minds wander. You try to connect dots that don't need to be connected and all other types of things, okay? All of the characters are original. They're made up by myself, yours truly, okay? So we don't have any type of misunderstandings or discrepancies in that area, guys, okay? So without any further ado, we are going to get on to tonight's story time, Twin Towers. The tale of two like souls bearing the same hardships yet living separate lives. Who knew a small town girl from nowhere could have so much in common with a little rich girl whom is a child star? One couldn't imagine the ironic, twisted collapse of twin towers whom never met. A mere coincidence, some may suspect, but the truth of the matter is a fact no one could ever expect. A beautiful, bountiful bundle of joy, born identical and anointed with greatness from birth, yet instill a malicious decision to split and switch the blessed double creation generated the generational curse that is bound to haunt the delightful duo forever. Nevertheless, the pair, never knowing their other half, dwelled in a shockingly corresponding horror in opposite lives. You see, Epiphany and Miraculous are genetically hybrid experiments formed by the United States government. The couple were both born into wealth as offspring of parents whom differ in traits. However, one of the twins, Epiphany to be exact, would suffer the unfair consequence of immediate separation, and unfortunately doomed to poverty for the remainder of her life, or so she thought. On the sacred day of July 7th, 2001, in an undisclosed, secure yet secret location, finally the moment had arrived. At 7 p.m., the 7-pound, 7-ounce lucky twins were born at last, promptly at sunset, when light and dark collide gracefully. The weather was mild, yet generously windy amongst humid temperatures. The setting was perfect, if only briefly, as the carbon copy babies bonded as they clinged to one another in silence. Just then, all too quickly and precisely at 7:07 p.m., charge nurse Miss Karen Battlefield entered and swiftly removed Epiphany, whom was relocated to the nursery where she was placed in an infant crib and under a heating lamp. Meanwhile, the proudful parents rejoiced as they cradled their specifically chosen newborn as if without a care. They were unbothered. They had just freely and willingly given up their other, now orphaned child. Ironically, little baby Miraculous began to release a faint sigh and cry as she whined endlessly for a period of time. It was as if Miraculous was somehow aware her sister Epiphany and she were no longer side by side. Strangely enough, Epiphany experienced the same symptoms as she and her sister unanimously longed for each other from separate rooms. Twin intuition, one may suspect. Nevertheless, Mr. and Mrs. Devlin spent the next couple of days with their newborn baby in a recovery room suite designated for wealthy patrons at the luxurious hospital Starlight Mercy Memorial, which catered to the rich and famous only, of course. Mr. Devlin, the heir of very high society, prestigious and wealthy family, has succeeded his elders as an extremely powerful business mogul, acquiring him the status of multi-billionaire. Mrs. Gracelyn Devlin, a divinely guided socialite whom is multi-talented, educated, and abundant in her own right. The Mrs. Beauty speaks volumes as she gracefully turns heads in every setting in which she appears. Not to mention, the classy, sassy lady compliments her husband's vast handsomeness as well, making the couple a dynamic duo. The A-list celebrity, whom is highly sought after, makes her fortune as the highest paid actress and model in the business. Mr. and Mrs. Devlin, husband and wife of the year for the past 15 years to be exact. The couple wed when Millard was 45 years old and Gracelyn was 21 years old. And being 15 years apart in age, the couple thought the perfect 15-year anniversary gift to themselves would be to complete their family with a bundle of joy. So the pair did just that. However, with the missus, of course, not wanting to unnecessarily bend her shape out of place, as if she could anyway, the husband and wife secretly faked Gracelyn's pregnancies for public appearances and discreetly chose a surrogate to birth their child. Something in which was the only obvious option anyway, seeing as Mrs. Gracelyn Devlin is a transgender woman. Yes, even with all the radiant beauty, pizzazz, class, and curves in all the right places, just as a biological woman, you see, the missus yet and still had her penis, just as Mr. Millard Devlin wanted. Nevertheless, from outer appearances, there's nothing not to love about the Devlins, or at least, so do most think. But behind closed doors, away from the prying eyes of the general public and the ridiculously nosy paparazzi, something far more sinister is hidden. Surrogate Miss Rachel Lawson, a 25-year-old struggling student of the arts whom was bound to never make it to the big time center stage with lights, cameras, action, fame, and fortune, settled for the next best thing when approached by one of Mr. Devlin's representatives with an offer she couldn't possibly refuse. However, there was a catch when things didn't quite go as expected. Sure enough, Rachel was offered more money than she had ever seen in her life, which by today's standards for such procedures actually carries a much higher financial agreement. But Rachel, being naive and in desperate need, accepted the amount of only $30,000, and the financial coverage of her medical bills and prenatal care. A total ripoff, especially after all Rachel endured. First of all, things did not go accordingly as planned. As arranged, Rachel was supposed to receive $15,000 up front and the other $15,000 after the delivery of the baby as well. As Rachel was forced to sign a non-disclosure agreement contract, which she did, but there was no transfer of funds as stated at the meeting to sign all the paperwork. Instead, Mr. Devlin found it best not to pay Rachel until she was indeed pregnant. Rachel felt angered by this, considering she had already signed a contract and did everything asked of her. On the day Rachel was due to appear at some specialized lab and clinic for the artificial insemination, Miss Lawson was picked up in a limousine from her hotel suite, which was sent by Mr. Devlin. However, when Rachel arrived to the secure hideout clinic, she was shocked to learn that there would be no regular insemination procedure at all. Miss Lawson was required to be washed thoroughly, which was done by staff dressed in all white. She then was placed naked on a lab bed for patients, where she was then strapped down by her wrists and ankles with her legs spread apart. By now, Rachel was hostile and frantic when someone whom appeared to be a nurse entered the room with a syringe and shot her up with some sort of drug. Just then, a lab tech then entered with a sterilized stainless steel case which contained specialized hybrid specimen eggs that was inserted inside of her. Rachel soon lay back still, wide awake, with tears rolling down her face, but she couldn't move, paralyzed from the drugs she had been given. Not long after, Mr. Devlin entered the room draped in a black robe and said, "Is it done?" Rachel was scared to death, but helpless to free herself from what was to come next. The staff dimmed the lights, lit an array of candles, and supplied Mr. Devlin his favorite party favors, which ranged from various different drugs and alcohol. Once the stage was set, the staff were promptly dismissed. Millard indulged himself in his choice of highs as he spake frank and recklessly to Rachel, and his seemingly endless slurs. Finally, when Mr. DeVille was ready for his close-up, he profusely raped Rachel repeatedly over a period of several hours. And when the doped-up Devlin eventually grew tired, much to Rachel's surprise, the trauma wasn't over, because now she laid watching in horror as Mrs. Graceland entered the room, whom had been enjoying the view in a separate area lounge. Rachel couldn't believe her bucked eyes as her tears rapidly ran down her face. The sheer fear that ran through her mind, body, and soul as she watched Graceland undress, horrified at the sight of the gorgeous wife whose penis was twice the size of her husband's. Nonetheless, no matter her beauty, Mrs. Devlin was in fact a beast who ravagely raped Rachel time and time again also. At some point, thankful the torture was over, but now bruised, bleeding, ripped, and sore, Rachel could do nothing but lay there in terrible pain as the drugs wore off. The Devlins didn't utter another word to the poor defenseless girl. They simply redressed, then ordered the staff to clean up the mess, and afterwards, they just left. Rachel remained in the clinic a few more days while she healed. Then she was relocated to the Devlin's guest house for observation. A month later, it was determined that Rachel was indeed pregnant from the previous encounter, at which time only then was the $15,000 deposited to Rachel's account. It was the saddest 9 months of Rachel's life. She just wanted it all to be over already. And now finally, that day had arrived at last. Rachel gave birth to 2 perfectly healthy twin girls, or so she thought. In fact, one of the twins were born female, and the other was born a hermaphrodite, with both male and female sex organs. Mr. Devlin was furious about the ordeal, as he wanted and rather preferred a son as his heir. In spite of Mr. Devlin's dislike of the matter, he only agreed to keep one of the children and abandon the other. Mrs. Devlin had no say in the matter and went along with her husband's desires. On the other hand, Rachel was saddened by this. Upon the birth of the twins, the Devlins excommunicated themselves with Rachel, actually having her things removed from their guest house while she was in labor. Angry at the whole ordeal altogether, Rachel thought long and hard on how to get back at the Devlins. She decided to mastermind the plan to try to blackmail the Devlins for her pain and suffering, but first, she checked her account to make sure the entire $30,000 had been deposited, and sure enough, like clockwork, it was. Now set out to destroy the Devlins, Rachel tried to figure out a way to abduct the other baby the Devlins neglected. Seeing as she was due to be discharged soon, Rachel had to think of something quick. When permitted, Rachel walked the halls of the luxurious hospital while making a mental note of everyone's comings and goings and their daily routine. Along the way, Rachel would stop by the nursery window in an attempt to locate the now abandoned orphaned baby. Strangely enough, Epiphany was set apart from all the rest of the babies and ironically isolated. But on this day, Rachel witnessed something rather interesting that bothered yet also altered her plans. It seems arrangements had already been made for poor Epiphany, and the doctor, nurse, hospital counselor, and an odd-looking couple were in discussion about the release of the child. Rachel watched closely as she eavesdropped, lurking her way closer and closer to the door to hear the conversation clearly. It seems the couple wasn't adoptive parents at all, but the owner-operators of a foster home for neglected babies. Once Rachel heard the location of the home, she took off quickly to devise another plan. On the following day, Rachel Lawson was released from the hospital and on her own. The luxurious treatment was over, and she had to find her own way home. The next 3 months of Rachel's life was the same as before she received that anonymously strange offer that fateful day. Her schooling wasn't going so well, and money was running out as stress mounted. During which time, Rachel researched several things online, one of which being the most common amount surrogates are paid. Something that totally pissed her off when finding out the average compensation amount is $50,000 to $80,000, plus expenses related to the pregnancy. Rachel was livid. She had been duped and grossly abused by the Devlins. The next task was to find out the home location of the orphan baby, a place fairly easy to locate and access. Once that was done, Rachel proceeded with Plan A. Confront the Devlins about the lack of money they had neglected to pay her and the abuse she endured, as well as the threat to expose the couple not only for what they had done to her, but their dirty little secrets too. Rachel made endless calls to the offices and home of the Devlins with no reply at all. Furious that the wealthy socialites would dare ignore her, she sent one last message and phone call to a private investigator who assured her he'd look into the matter for a small fee, of course, $10,000. Appalled, she had already been gypped. Now here this scumbag was trying to hustle her out of more money. Needless to say, Miss Lawson paid the $10,000, and the investigator went to work, Rachel thought. What the hell is the worst that could happen at this point? But she clearly had no idea. Sure enough, the PI got to work, but Rachel had no clue as to what would happen next. Come to find out, the PI knew the Devlins very well, which he had failed to tell Rachel. Mr. Mitch Slum was his name, whom arranged a meeting with Mr. Devlin. To say Millard was angry that Rachel would go to such lengths to get more money out of him was an understatement. After the meeting, however, Mr. Millard Devlin made a few phone calls of his own. Being the rich and famous, powerful businessman he was, he absolutely had no intentions on giving Rachel Lawson another dime. In fact, he paid the private investigator another $10,000 to drop his investigation and never contact Rachel again. He then contacted his lawyer in an effort to bury the matter altogether. Next, he called the dean of Rachel's school and her landlord at her place of residence, as well as the owner of her part-time job at the art museum. All persons in which were all too eager to accept a payment from Mr. Devlin to handle his lightweight, as he referred to Rachel. By the next week had arrived, Rachel hadn't heard from the private investigator, who was now also avoiding her calls. She was kicked out of her performing arts school, evicted from her apartment, and fired from her job of 5 years. Rachel was heartbroken and flat broke. It felt as if she had been robbed and brutally raped all over again. But poor little Rachel Lawson wasn't about to give up hope just yet. Rachel sadly used what little income she had left to move into a one-room efficiency apartment. She then went on to Plan B, the abduction of baby Epiphany. Rachel figured she'd kill 2 birds with 1 stone by seeking modest employment also. Since it was forbidden to disclose the parents of the neglected orphan child, then the hospital didn't release that information to the foster home owners. In fact, the home itself was a fraudulently run business funded by the government and the elite powers that be. The owners were paid in cash under the table to handle the needs and the care of the orphans until secret, hidden, fraudulent adoptions were arranged for them. The perfect opportunity had presented itself for Rachel. She applied for a housekeeping position at the home, and since the business was being run illegally in the first place, then it was no surprise Rachel was paid for her services in cash. Which was great, considering proper paperwork wasn't filed, which would have revealed Rachel's true identity. With 1 foot in the door, Rachel was eager that this opportunity would afford her the chance to be near the babies. She was to begin work immediately, which was just fine with her, and for the next 3 months, Rachel settled in her new position, being sure not to alarm the owners as she observed the babies closely. Luckily for her, each child had name tags, so it was fairly easy to identify Epiphany. After 4 months on the job, when the twins were now 7 months old, Rachel felt it was the perfect opportunity to take her chances with kidnapping Epiphany. With the cook hard at work in the kitchen, the nannies tending to the older children on the playground, and the owners closed off in their office, Rachel crept quietly towards the infant room. All the babies were asleep and no nanny staff in sight. Quickly, Rachel grabbed Epiphany from the crib, placed her in a big carrying handbag she normally kept her lunch, jacket, and umbrella in, and hurried towards the back door of the estate before anyone could notice her. In a haste, Rachel placed the bag in her car and drove away as fast as she could, briefly stopping to wave goodbye to the groundskeeper who was outside tending to the landscaping. Once far enough away, Rachel pulled over to take Epiphany out of the bag and put her in a car seat that was hidden in her trunk. Then she sped away out of the area as fast as she could. While safely on the other side of town, yet stuck in traffic, Rachel wrestled with her thoughts of what to do next. Around the same time, the house live-in nannies finally noticed a baby was missing from the nursery, and they alerted the owners. Mad as hell about the manner, the nannies were harshly punished severely. But with the foster home's operations being fraudulently run, the owners surely couldn't alert the police. They did, however, contact their elite counterparts, whom wasn't at all pleased, to say the least. But it didn't much matter anyway, because now, upon checking, Rachel had given the owners a false name and personal information, so there was no way to track her. With no visitors that day, the owners figured it was she whom took one of the children, which was Epiphany. Ironically, yet undoubtedly no coincidence, back at the Devlin's mansion, they had quite the scare as well right around the same time baby Epiphany was abducted. It seems the same fear of such a thing happening to Miraculous occurred as well when her live-in nanny didn't return with her at the designated time as requested. Several hours went by with no word from the family's nanny. In a panic, Miss Devlin alerted her husband, who quickly sprung into action to order a manhunt for the nanny and the safe return of their baby girl. Come to find out, by authorities, the Devlin's nanny and daughter wasn't missing at all. Just so happened the two were held up in traffic outside of the pediatrician's office they had visited for a miraculous appointment. It seemed that there was a pileup due to a wreck that had lanes closed off and vehicles backed up for miles, which made the nanny late. Returning to the Devlin's home with their daughter. Relieved that there wasn't anything wrong and the worst hadn't happened, the Devlin's nerves were at ease as they waited in anticipation for their safe return. Unknowingly, however, Rachel and Epiphany sat side by side in traffic right next to none other than the Devlin's nanny and Miraculous. Despite the long wait, both the twins sat in their car seats calmly with a slight grin on their face as they peered out the window. Finally, traffic was moving again, and the women went their separate ways. Once at the intersection, Rachel made a right turn, and the Devlin's nanny turned left. All at once, both Epiphany and Miraculous, although in opposite cars, let out an awful cry of agony until they reached their destination. At last, Rachel cautiously approached her apartment, being sure she hadn't been located by anyone. And the nanny safely returned with Miraculous as well, which the Devlins were glad, but made further preparations for the nanny and Miraculous to be accompanied by a driver and bodyguard from then on. Rachel relaxed as she settled Epiphany, feeding the baby and changing her diaper, when she was faced with a rude awakening. Rachel was shocked to find out Epiphany had both male and female genitals, which she became very frustrated by. Reliving the memory of the horrific day the twins were conceived and all she had endured, Rachel suddenly began to break down and cry as a fierce hatred for the Devlins consumed her entirely. A feeling, unfortunately, Rachel began to feel for baby Epiphany as well. Rachel Lawson knew they couldn't stay in the California area for much longer because there was a great risk she could be spotted by someone familiar any day. Not to mention the cost of living was very high there. With only $5,000 to her name, Rachel and Epiphany moved to a smaller state and town in Nashville, Tennessee. Forced to apply for public assistance, Rachel and Epiphany now lived in poverty. Rachel was actually disgusted at raising Epiphany, growing more and more furious every day at the sight of the baby. Not even sure as to what to refer to the child as, whether girl or boy, her hatred not only for the Devlins but now also Epiphany grew rapidly every day. Nevertheless, Rachel now had a plan to blackmail the Devlins. She took several pictures of Epiphany and herself and once again made an attempt to contact the Devlins. Only this time, she had leverage, which was baby Epiphany. With nothing left to lose, Rachel was determined to win at all costs. Rachel repeatedly called and even wrote to the Devlins, ordering them to pay her another $30,000, but yearly, or she would file charges against the couple for fraud, rape, and abuse of power for her pain and her suffering. Rachel also threatened to contact the media to expose the couple publicly. The Devlins were mad as hell. Rachel had come back to hunt them yet again, but this time their hands were tied, seeing as Rachel could produce a DNA test to prove that she was the actual birth mother at any time. This was a scandal the Devlins couldn't afford to risk getting leaked in any way for the sake of their careers. After consulting their family's attorney, the Devlins' lawyer advised the Devlins to just pay Rachel off. Millard in no way wanted to do that and thought if he could get Rachel to come back to California to sign another contract, then he could trick her and have her killed instead. Upon arrival, but Rachel wasn't taking any chances and refused to do so. Instead, Rachel requested direct payments by the twins' first birthday or she was going to the media. Millard Devlin reluctantly agreed, but promptly hired hackers, trackers, private investigators, and a hitman to figure out Rachel Lawson's current location. Millard also conversed about the matter to some elite, prominent figures in authority, and a fixer as well, who know how to handle such issues. On the twins' first birthday, Rachel was shockingly surprised to have received the $30,000. Enthralled with the fact her plan actually worked, Rachel still went ahead to secure further insurance to ensure that the payments would continue to come. Rachel proceeded with the DNA testing anyway. As well did she obtain medical records of the birth and documentation of her loss of her art scholarship, wrongful termination from the art gallery museum, and the unjust eviction notice, all of which Rachel supplied the Devlins a copy of, and threats to turn in all of the information if the payments did not continue. Mrs. Graceland Devlin began to despise Rachel, and as a result, the money-hungry gold digger started to unravel. Frequent arguments and loud fights rang through the Devlin mansion often. Both the Mr. and Mrs. indulged more and more in their drugs and alcohol habits, just as much as Millard spake daily with his hired help and angrily urged them to hurry up and find the bitch. He shouted. Meanwhile, with all the money Rachel collected, she didn't spend much of anything on Epiphany. In fact, Epiphany never had more than the bare necessities, the very bare minimum, if anything at all, and endured an array of abuse by Rachel, seeing as she hated the child so. After a while, a ridiculous kind of narcissistic jealousy grew within Rachel. Epiphany was yet and still the neglected orphan as she always was. Startlingly enough, life wasn't any better for Miraculous, except for the fact that she was rich and living in luxury. Miraculous parents, Millard and Graceland, weren't at all nurturing, loving, or attentive either, leaving her neglected often in the care of her nanny. The Devlins were often away or heavily under the influence of some kind of substance when they were present. For 6 straight years, the twins experienced the exact same drama, trauma, emotional, and physical abuse. Rachel was receiving $30,000 yearly for Epiphany and never once treated the girl like she actually loved her. In 6 years, Rachel had received a total of $180,000, which she had hid just in case something happened to her. Rachel spent just enough to buy a home in foreclosure in a halfway decent neighborhood and to buy her a nice SUV truck. Other than that, Rachel spent just enough to cover the expenses from month to month. But by the time the twins' 7th birthday, things went from bad to worse. The twins were in their 2nd year of school by now, whereas Epiphany was in public school. Miraculous was enrolled in a very prestigious school for the wealthy, gifted, and talented. Both the girls, although in different settings, were loners and particularly quiet. Epiphany wanted to fit in but didn't have friends and often was teased and bullied, so she was often to herself and alone. Miraculous was surrounded by very bright and bubbly children whom tried to interact with her, but Miraculous just wasn't interested at all and much rather create arts and crafts by herself. The current day is July 7th, 2008, and it should have been a special day seeing it was the twins' 7th birthday. But there was nothing exciting happening for the girls. In fact, it was the very day tragedy began for the twins. Twin number one. It was Saturday, and Rachel Lawson was up and about early expecting her reoccurring payment that never was deposited, something that totally enraged her. Of course, her anger was taken out on Epiphany, whom was yelled at and periodically beat throughout the day. Something was wrong, and Rachel was determined to find out what it was. Rachel invited her boyfriend over, and the pair strategized a plan on how to attack back at the Devlins. Rachel's boyfriend, Vin Humphrey, scared Epiphany. He was always staring at her weirdly. He acted nice around Rachel, but soon as her back was turned, he did strange things. Regardless, there was good reason for Rachel not receiving a payment. It seems that Mr. Devlin relentlessly searched for Rachel and Epiphany and had paid off with the assistance of Mr. Devlin's high-profile contacts in the government. The payments were frozen until Rachel Lawson signed a contract, which she found out when she went to check her P.O. box. Rachel's blood was boiling by this point, so she focused the entire day on arranging documentation to send to the media. Rachel also harassed the Devlins throughout the day, leaving numerous messages, refusing to sign any contract unless it was mailed to her. Otherwise, she threatened to contact a lawyer and the media Monday morning. Poor little Epiphany, whom didn't understand what was going on because everything about her real parents was hidden from her. She was sad all day long and neglected as always. Rachel didn't even wish the poor child a happy birthday. All she cared about was the money, so she and her boyfriend then drank and smoked all day. But by nightfall, Epiphany's awful day, which felt like a bad dream, turned into a horrific nightmare. When Rachel's boyfriend Vin crept into Epiphany's room, awakening her, to expose himself to her, Epiphany's eyes were bucked in fear as Vin quickly placed his hand over her mouth before she could scream. From the startling pain of Vin pinching her chest and nipples through her nightgown, tears rolled down the young girl's face as the monster in the dark shoved his penis in her mouth. It seemed like forever in the mind of the child when suddenly a creamy substance filled her face and mouth. Epiphany gasped for air as she gagged, cried, and vomited on the creepy crawler whom came to rob her of her innocence in the night. But as Epiphany raised her head to catch her breath, she was surprised by the shadows of her mother standing in the doorway, smoking a cigarette with an evil grin upon her face. The evil pair left her, and Epiphany cried herself to sleep. Twin 2. Meanwhile, thousands of miles away, back in California, amongst the wealthiest elite, the energy within the Devlin's mansion wasn't any better for Miraculous, whom spent her 7th birthday alone as well. Miraculous' parents were away for much of the day, but people were in and out the mansion throughout the day, planning, prepping, and arranging decorations. However, not for a celebration for Miraculous, but yet another of their wild, spontaneous mansion parties. The nanny tried to make Miraculous as comfortable as possible, and she did indeed have lavish gifts left for her in her playroom, as did the cook bake her a strawberry shortcake cake. Yet, saddened Miraculous felt all alone as always. The Devlins weren't at all interested in showing her love, attention, or affection to their daughter, thinking their money was good enough to make up for their absence. Furthermore, when the couple was around, they were always under the influence of something and awfully rude to Miraculous, especially if she got in their way. Needless to say, Miraculous was groomed and trained on how to behave since she was 1 year old, so the routine was familiar to her by now, even at the tender age of now 7 years old. Nevertheless, Miraculous played a while in her grand playroom, opened her gifts alone, and had cake and ice cream. Soon thereafter, little Miraculous retreated to her room for the rest of the day, as directed by her nanny, Mrs. Mary Jonas, whom reminded Miraculous it was best for her not to get in the way or anger her parents, whom were due to arrive at any moment. Mrs. Jonas also prompted Miraculous that she would be back later to groom and ready her for the evening engagement. 6 p.m. The Devlins arrived home, and instantly the drama began to unfold. Graceland immediately started shouting at the party planners about the decorating designs on the patio deck. Uninterested, Millard was preoccupied on his phone with his informant. He stopped at the bar to fix him a stiff drink as always. Then he relocated to his office, closing the door behind him. It wasn't long before the distant yelling and profanity seeping from the cracks of Mr. Devlin's door rang through the foyer. Millard's temper was flaring to an extreme as he conversed back and forth with his secret contacts. Of course, the topic was Rachel Lawson and the most recent issue at hand. The messages of threats was relayed to Millard, and he wasn't happy at all, to say the least. Regardless, Mr. Devlin told his lawyer to draw up the contract and send it to Rachel. The private investigator interrupted the conversation, asking Mr. Devlin should he be continuing to track Rachel Lawson since they now had her location, which he replied, yes, but keep your distance. The private investigator responded, great, and the conversation ended. A few VIPs working with Mr. Devlin were amongst many on the invite list for the cocktail party that evening, so Millard would see them then and finish their conversation at that time. Nanny Miss Mary approached Mrs. Devlin in the backyard. Excuse me, miss, I wanted to remind you of Miraculous' birthday today. I thought maybe you'd like to spend some time with her before the evening event, she said. Graceland sighed and replied, oh, don't be so dramatic, Mary. I'm much too busy for that. Didn't she get her gifts? Miss Mary said, well, yes, ma'am, but Mrs. Devlin cut her off. Well, then, that should be good enough. Now, excuse me. Frustrated, Miss Mary just said, very well, and walked away. It was 7:20 p.m., so she proceeded to Miraculous' room to get her ready for the festivities for the evening. Mr. and Mrs. Devlin made their way to their master bedroom to prepare themselves for the party, which was set to begin very soon. Whereas normally Miraculous was put to bed around 8 p.m., tonight was different, and the nanny was given strict orders to have her ready by 9 p.m. Upon entering Miraculous' room, Miss Mary Jonas awakened the little girl whom had fallen asleep at the foot of her bed. Mary performed her duties as requested by Mrs. Devlin. She ran a bubble bath for Miraculous, picked out her evening attire, and set it aside. Put the little girl in the tub and bathed her thoroughly. Afterwards, Miss Mary combed and styled her hair and dressed Miraculous, during which time Mary had a very important conversation with Miraculous, starting with telling the young girl not to speak unless spoken to, and to be very sure not to make her parents angry or embarrass them. Miraculous sat still while listening with a confused look on her face, but replied, yes, ma'am. Lastly, Miss Mary told Miraculous a strange story about little girls whom are forced to grow up too soon. Mary said the night would be special, and she'd never forget this day, because tonight was the night that she'd learned to be a big girl. Mary also added, no matter how frightened the girl may get, always remember your manners and stay polite. Miraculous had no clue what Miss Mary meant, but she nodded her head in agreement and tried to remember everything she said. At 8 p.m., there was a knock at the door. Moments later, the door swung open, and it was Mrs. Devlin. Great, she said excitedly. She's ready. Miss Mary responded, yes, ma'am, she is. Graceland reminded Mary to bring Miraculous downstairs at precisely 9 p.m. Just then, the cook, Sandy Mitchell, entered with a tray of food for Miraculous, which included a specially blended berry drink that Mrs. Devlin insisted Mary made sure Miraculous drank every bit of. Mary shook her head, okay. Sandy rolled her eyes and made her exit. Graceland said, well done, and see you later, as she turned away to leave with a crooked smile. It was sad. She didn't even acknowledge Miraculous at all, not even to say happy birthday, Mary thought. Not to mention, she was very unsettled about the evening's events and the fact that she knew Miraculous juice was drugged. Nevertheless, Mary did what she was told and made sure Miraculous ate her dinner and drank all of her juice as requested by the girl's mother. 8:30 p.m. and the Devlin's cocktail party has begun. Constant chimes of the doorbell rang again and again as a wealthy elite guest stormed the estates. Distant chatter, laughter, and endless clanking of wine glasses, martini glasses, and shot glasses could be heard throughout the lavish mansion. The cook, Sandy Mitchell, prepared an array of appetizers, hors d'oeuvres, delicate desserts, and other refreshments, served by the mansion's maid staff. Most of the guests were scattered about between the foyer, ballroom, and patio lawn. Strobe lights were flashing and the live DJ entertained the crowd as the host, Mr. and Mrs. Devlin, mingled amongst their rich and famous friends. 9 p.m. Nanny Mary Jonas walked side by side with Miraculous as they casually walked down the long spiral staircase. When they finally reached the bottom of the foyer, the doorbell rang yet again. Mrs. Devlin swung around in excitement and cheered and said, "Oh, yay, more guests." As she proceeded anxiously to the door, she noticed Miraculous and Mary out the corner of her eyes. Graceland smiled and simply said, "Perfect, right on time." Graceland graciously opened the door and a loud crackle sang from the ladies as they greeted each other. It was none other than one of the elite's most notorious Madam Breeders, Laura Stark, whom is also very wealthy and privileged due to her services she provides the rich and famous. Lagging in tow, Laura brought along with her, as requested, 3 of her children, Daniel, Amy, and Timothy. Without warning, Graceland snapped, shouting at Mary, "Don't just stand there. Take the children to the back patio yard to play." Mary nodded and did as she was told, leading the way for the children as all the guests gawked and stared at them. Miraculous, Daniel, Amy, and Timothy all seemed to have the same gloomy-eyed, drowsy look, so Mary suggested to the kids to run around and play while she go fetch them water and snacks. The kids danced around the lawn large fountain and played on Miraculous mega-sized outdoor play center, while the adults partied, mixed and mingled all night. Around 10:15 p.m., Mr. Millard Devlin gathered several of his occultist buddies for a brief meeting in his office. In attendance was politicians Mayor Vincent Bloom and Governor Albert Jennings, CEO Bobby Coleman, and Danny Sanders, music producer Andy Long, and movie director Lorenzo Simmons. With stiff drinks in hand and cigars ablazing, the men indulged in some cocaine use while in open discussion. It came as no surprise to Millard Devlin that amongst the topic of conversation was in reference to his daughter Miraculous, which CEO Danny Sanders, as well as Mayor Vincent Bloom, made a point to compliment her beauty. Mr. Devlin was all too eager to agree as he replied, "Yes, indeed. I will be sure to introduce you all to her later." "Great, looking forward to it," Governor Albert Jennings said with a creepy, sadistic smirk on his face. Bobby Coleman took the moment of eerie silence to insert himself in the conversation by asking Millard Devlin about his ongoing little problem, which was in reference to Rachel Lawson and the orphaned twin. Before Millard could utter a single word, Mayor Vincent Bloom interrupted by suggesting the scandal need to be handled quickly, which all in attendance agreed. Millard paced the room back and forth before stating, "Well, guys, I have a very reliable private investigator source and some contacts within the CIA tracking the bitch. Also, including his lawyer is handling the contract being drawn up as they speak." "Yes, that's good," billionaire movie director Lorenzo Simmons said, also adding, The sooner Millard could get her under a contractual agreement, then that would prevent her legally from coming forward with any evidence. Exactly. CEO Bobby Coleman blurted out. And then we can get our guys to eliminate the whore for good. Millard Devlin anxiously agreed, but couldn't refrain from wondering aloud, what about the kid? Producer Andy Long said, well, we could either eventually put the kid to good use underground and get rid of her altogether, too. All the men agreed and swore by their brotherhood oaths to keep the matter secret and amongst them. The highly intoxicated gentlemen laughed aloud and finished powdering their nose before returning to the party. As the group parted, Danny Sanders made mention to Millard. So what time does the after party begin? Millard smiled and rubbed his chin while patting Danny on the shoulders, then said, how does around midnight sound, my friend? Danny and the other men excitedly said, sounds like a great time for a play date. The sliding doors opened to the entrance of Millard Devlin's office as the men walked into the foyer of the mansion. Just then, the group of the men met with Madame Laura Stark and Graceland Devlin. Always a pleasure to see you, Madam, Mayor Vincent Bloom said, as he handed Laura an envelope that contained $45,000. Laura replied, the pleasure is all mine, Mr. Mayor. Great, Mayor Bloom said, and you're looking ravishing as ever, Graceland, the mayor added. Well, thank you kindly, sir, Graceland replied. The group of the men already aroused, undressing the ladies with their eyes. Director Lorenzo Simmons exclaimed, we are looking forward to seeing you both in the hot tub later. Graceland and Laura chuckled as they pranced away. We wouldn't miss it. Graceland, Laura, and a few other high-profile socialites gathered in the lounge for some party favors of their own. The multitude of drugs and alcohol was a free-for-all in attendance, so by now, everyone was under the influence of something. Many of the guest rooms were already occupied with plenty of sexual and ritualistic satanic practices of all kinds. All the staff were relieved of their duties and dismissed to the guest house, for the exception of the nanny, whom was responsible for looking after the children. Nanny Mary Jonas was ordered to change the children into their swim attire and have them in the pool area by midnight for their hot tub party, in which she followed orders as always with a little assistance of Graceland, who insisted Mary take an ecstasy pill to loosen her up a bit. Both Mary and the children were kept diluted with a substance laced in their drinks throughout the night as well. Meanwhile, they were more relaxed with being groped, fondled, and sexually harassed throughout the duration of the party. Mary and the 4 children retreated to Miraculous Room and changed their clothes as requested of them. Then they promptly returned to the pool deck. Mary permitted the children to get in and play until further instruction from Graceland. 12 a.m. midnight. The Devlin's cocktail party had begun to wind down a bit, whereas some of the happy, highly satisfied guests had made their exit to rendezvous elsewhere with their sneaky link affairs. They departed with and other severely intoxicated guests preoccupied in several of the mansion's guest rooms for their own private parties of threesomes, orgies, drug-infused BDSM fetish fantasy fun, etc., the Dublins were hosting a private VIP party playdate of their own. Those with special invites gathered together at midnight on the back patio for a hot tub after party, which included Mr. and Mrs. Devlin, Laura Stark, Mayor Vincent Bloom, Governor Albert Jennings, CEOs Bobby Coleman, Danny Sanders, producer Andy Long, director Lorenzo Simmons, and his wife Susanna Simmons. Also, when prompted, Mary Jonas produced the four children as directed. It didn't take long before the VIP guests and others stripped off their clothes, hopped in the hot tub, and of course the group couldn't do without their party favors of drugs, alcohol, and the young children, whom was forced to join them in this freak fest. The adults made out with each other, swapping from one partner to another, eventually engaging in sex of all kinds right in front of the children. Between the group's drug, alcohol, and sex-crazed binge, the children were passed around the hot tub like Raggedy Ann dolls. Mary Jonas was even forced to participate when producer Andy Long forcibly sodomized her. There was men on men, women on women, men molesting and forcing the children to perform oral sex, not to mention each of the men had their turn with all the women, while the women sat back and laughed as the young children were taken advantage of. This was a heartbreaking and shocking reality for Miraculous, the beginning of the end of her childhood. Sadly, Laura Stark's kids was used to this kind of abuse, as she made them available to elite wealthy people in power for a small fee, of course, of $15,000 per child. Madame Laura Stark, also a breeder for the elite. She has had several children she sold to rich and famous for various reasons, like satanic rituals, blood sacrifices, sex slaves, satanic ritual abuse, as well as adoptions. Madame Laura Stark pimps out her own children that she chooses to keep. As well does she sell her breast milk and her children's blood to very powerful people. In fact, Laura provides an array of sexual services, even to wealthy men who have kinky fetishes of being adult babies and desiring Laura Stark to play their mothers while she changed their adult diapers, breastfeed them, and even spank them. Laura actually find it rather interesting just how many wealthy, powerful men behind the scenes like being dominated by women whom play their mothers, something in which stems from childhood trauma of their own, which they endured gross abuse from their mommies. They later grew a sexual fascination for. 3 a.m. and finally, the sick encounter was over. Mary was ordered to put Miraculous to bed, whom by now was crying profusely and complaining of her throat hurting. Mary eagerly did as she was told, as she too was desperate to get away from her abusers as well. Although Mary served as a nanny for Miraculous, she was in fact a sex slave whom was lured by the Devlins when she was 20 years old to their mansion with the promise of a lucrative, high-paying job. Mary assisted Miraculous by getting her some medicine for her sore throat and managed to get the little girl to bed. Laura Stark rounded up her children as well and bid the Devlins a good night as she and the children entered their limousine, which was waiting for them. Mr. Devlin and the other VIPs chatted and raved about the good time they had before bidding Mr. and Mrs. Devlin a good night, then departing in their separate luxury vehicles. Satisfied the party was a success, Graceland and Millard retired to their master bedroom to shower before they went to bed. Bright and early Monday morning, Graceland arose early to handle her daily affairs. Mary prepared miraculous for the day and escorted her to breakfast. Millard set out to handle some important business at his office, and upon arrival, Millard's lawyer was waiting on him. Mr. Devlin apologized for keeping Mr. Johnny Bush waiting as the pair proceeded to Mr. Millard's office. Mr. Bush informed Mr. Devlin of the most recent arrangements made concerning his ongoing problem, which included the contract he prepared and sent to Rachel Lawson. Mr. Devlin wasn't at all pleased with being blackmailed, but he continued to go along with the setup in an effort to eventually eliminate the problem altogether. As the gentleman spoke, Mr. Devlin received an email of the scanned and signed contract document from Rachel Lawson, whom was yet and still threatening a huge public scandal of the release of information if the payments stopped again. But because of the inconvenience, now Rachel Lawson was demanding $36,000 for the payment being delayed. Furious, Millard shouted at his lawyer to release the damn funds. He then called for his assistant to get his private investigator on the phone. Johnny Bush excused himself to handle the funds transfer. Throughout the day, Mr. Devlin spoke with the private investigator and his CIA contacts because Millard was paying an extreme amount of money to have Rachel Lawson targeted, which a third-party company was handling the operations of. Something Rachel Lawson began to notice was happening after realizing she was being stalked, followed, and harassed by random persons. When Rachel finally received delayed payment, she and Epiphany packed up and moved yet again. Relocating became a frequent habit. The more and more Rachel felt uneasy about their surroundings. Over the years, as the twins grew up enduring satanic ritual abuse, their horrific childhood trauma mirrored each other, and every 7 years there was elaborate staged events that took place which greatly affected them both. Between the ages of 8 and 13 years old, with both children being tracked and closely monitored by the government, each of the twins were implanted with RFID chips during a routine dental visit, where in fact the girls were put to sleep for the surgical procedures. The twins were also groomed and under heavy mind control, kept drugged with heavy sedatives, and programmed to be sex kittens, child sex slaves, whereas the Devlins were in agreement with these procedures. Rachel Lawson was forced to comply by her contractual agreement. Besides the twins being subjected to endless satanic ritual abuse, the twins were frequently exposed to physical, mental, emotional, psychological, and sexual abuse. Both of the twins are extremely gifted and talented, creative and artistic, but Epiphany was unfairly treated as her abilities are purposely neglected in an effort to make her feel unworthy or not good enough. Miraculous, however, with wealthy parents, was expected to excel. Miraculous is well on her way as a child star thanks to her well-to-do, high society, ultra-rich parents. Miraculous has many pageants she has been forced to participate in by her mother, which of course she always won, as well as she is a model for several expensive name brand companies. Miraculous currently models for her own brand of clothing, shoes, accessories, and toy line. As do she act currently on the cast of the most popular children's TV show at Nickel Studios, with the occasion collaboration with the Disney franchise. Over the unfortunate years of the twins' lives, Miraculous seemed to be severely withdrawn and numb to the pain from the endless abuse. Epiphany, however, has begun to rebel as her anger has overwhelmed her. Depression and stress has plagued and possessed the mind, body, and soul of the distant twins whom struggle to cope with their circumstances. Furthermore, although the targeting, intimidation tactics, gang stalking, harassment, invasion of privacy, and endless touchless torture persisted and has gotten more severe and aggressive, Rachel Lawson yet and still received payments yearly of now $36,000. Yet no one knew Rachel had every intention of releasing the information anyway. Nevertheless, Mr. and Mrs. Devlin stopped at nothing to strategize with their team on when, where, and how to blood sacrifice Rachel Lawson. Everyone knew she was a target, and Millard's informants updated him daily about Rachel and Epiphany's whereabouts. And the wealthy, powerful business mogul plotted, planned, schemed, and set up the arrangements to take out Rachel Lawson and human traffic Epiphany at the right time. However, unaware, a sudden change of events would alter his previous organized plans altogether. The twins' 14th birthday. Twin number 1. Epiphany's 14th birthday was just as any other day. Nothing was ever done to make Epiphany feel special, and frankly, she was used to the neglect by now. All Rachel seemed to care about was her annual income she'd receive, which she rarely put forth any effort to spend anything on Epiphany. Epiphany hated her mother to death because of all the years of abuse, and she couldn't wait to get the hell out of there. Their arguments were loud and frequent now that Epiphany could speak up for herself, resist and fight back. But on this fateful day, Epiphany had enough of the trauma and the drama when one of many of her mother's boyfriends had come in to rape her, like he had so many times before, while Rachel did nothing about it. Epiphany wasn't scared and shy anymore. She was mad as hell and determined to fight back. Rebellion was now amongst Epiphany's daily routine, and she was bound to find a way out. So that day was the first time Epiphany ran away from home. Friendless, with no money and nowhere to go, Epiphany ended up in the company of an older crowd whom had bad habits and a bad influence on her. Although she was still in the area of her local community, Epiphany was still being tracked via her chip. Little did she know, Linked up with an older associate from her school and a few others, Epiphany was convinced that drinking alcohol for her birthday would be a good idea. Hesitant to do so, but not wanting to upset the only people she had to hang out with, Epiphany took a few sips of liquor the group had. It wasn't long before she felt tipsy and became dizzy right away. But of course, that was mainly because the young girl's drink was roofied on purpose. Epiphany's older school associate, Marissa Arnold, whom was 16 years old, laughed along with her friends as they found it funny to drug her and watch her pass out. The group made a mockery of Epiphany and even went as far as stripping her of all her clothes and leaving her alone at the local park. Luckily, Epiphany was found and rushed to the hospital for treatment. The nurse contacted Rachel Lawson about the incident, and whom didn't seem to care and wasn't even looking for her daughter at all. Discharged the very next day, Epiphany was upset she had to return home to all the yelling, fighting, and abuse. She locked herself in her room and refused to come out for days unless she was sure Rachel and her boyfriend were gone. Twin 2, Miraculous, however, had become a bit of a spoiled brat. With a birthday in the middle of summer, she was eager to have fun every chance she got. Although her parents were yet and still neglectful and abusive, Miraculous had an endless supply of money and seemingly got whatever she wanted. After all, she learned from the best, if ever there was a problem, to just throw money at it and move on. Miraculous was very intelligent for her age, and she had no problem making sure mommy and daddy paid for all of her pain, suffering, and luxuries. As always, it was Nanny Mary whom tended to all Miraculous needs. Cook Sandy prepared a feast of treats for the young girl, and she was showered with expensive gifts as always. But today, Miraculous was having her very own pool party she called a Splish Splash Birthday Bash. Many famous celebrity and rich and powerful people's teenagers were to attend the party. So the morning was jam-packed with catering crews and party planners setting up decorations and entertainment for the afternoon celebration. The evening engagement would include swimming, teen celebrity entertainers, magicians, a live DJ, a foaming, bubbly, bouncing magic castle, go-kart riding, miniature golf, and an array of games and appetizers such as ping pong and pizza, amongst many other activities arranged for the black and white checkerboard fairy tale magic themed party. Each guest attending were asked to dress in their favorite character in swimwear. Miraculous costume's choice is Minnie Mouse. Her attire was custom made just for her, which featured a black and white polka dot two-piece swimsuit with a lace see-through pink flare dress, a huge pink bow with Minnie Mouse ears, attached headband, and sparkling black and white Minnie Mouse flip-flops which also had a pink bow attached to the top of the sandal. Miraculous also had her own makeup artist, nail tech, and hairstylist, who would also attend the party to pamper the other girls. Miraculous was overly excited as the function was bound to be eventful. With an unlimited budget, the get-together roughly cost in the range of $1.5 million. Mr. and Mrs. Devlin would, of course, be in attendance, but wasn't at all interested in handling the details of the event, so that was all organized by hired help. In fact, the couple spent the day indulging in their sinful pleasures, which had them loaded by midday, yet eagerly anticipating entertaining and mingling amongst the adults attending the celebration with their kids, whom they would amuse in the mansion's lounge. 12 p.m. noonday, and the party was set to begin. Limousines and luxury vehicles swarmed the property all at once, one right after another. Miraculous waited anxiously in the foyer of the mansion to greet her guests, and as every wealthy popular teen arrived, screams of girly joy echoed all through the mansion. Before long, the estate was jam-packed with teenagers between the ages of 14 and 18 years old. Most were dropped off by their assigned drivers and bodyguards, but several others were accompanied by their rich and famous parents. A stampede of teens rushed the backyard lawn for fun in the sun, and the adults were escorted to the lounge with their hosts Millard and Graceland Devlin, whom had planned entertainment of their own. The women quickly gathered together as the men lit their Cuban cigars and socialized at the poker tables for some gambling fun of their own. Before long, millions of dollars was up for grabs. The bartender kept everyone's alcoholic beverage of choice refreshed, and the servants delivered scrumptious appetizers for the intimate group to enjoy as well. For the Devlins, it wouldn't be a party without party favors, in which they were happy to oblige and supply their guests with. Within the Devlins' enormous lounge den was one of few different separate rooms, one of which was completely see-through, as it had glass sliding door entrances. Graceland led the way for the other ladies as she invited them to mingle with her in the looking glass room, as she called it. The women laughed, talked, drank martinis, and took shots while smoking weed and powdering their nose. The room also had a home theater system where the ladies watched the outside festivities of Miraculous Party. The wild and free teens were having a blast as the live DJ kept the crowd hype. As it seemed, it was no surprise that many of the older teens had acquired bad habits of their own, which was of no surprise or bother at all to anyone. As a result, but of course, the party punch was spiked with vodka, so the teens were actually rather tipsy. And some of them even had their own supply of pills and other upper party drugs, obviously taking after their parents' addictions. Ironically, Graceland and her lady friends found humor in the matter and didn't at all put forth any effort to put an end to the madness. Highly intoxicated, the women even joked with the men about it, which was met with an erroneous reaction of a loud outburst of laughter, and reply by one of the fathers saying, "Oh well, let them have fun. They've learned from the best how to party." 3 p.m. and the celebration was yet and still a full throttle of adventure. High as a kite, the teens danced and partied into the night, jamming to a mixture of pop, country, rock, and rap music. Around 6 p.m., many of the teenagers whom were dropped off were recovered by their bodyguards to return them home. Several others had snuck off for a makeout session in the guest house, and all the teens, accompanied by their parents, continued to party on as it was decided they would stay over for a co-ed slumber. At about 8 p.m., all the hired help wrapped up to depart the premises. Meanwhile, the mansion staff and the cleaning crew proceeded to clean up after the party. The rambunctious teen partiers were still wired up, even though they had dwindled down to 10 in their gathering. Full of energy, the small crowd raced each other upstairs to change into their pajamas before retreating to the home theater room to watch a movie. On the other hand, the happy wanderers' parents were beyond plastered at this point and had become rather frisky and touchy-feely with one another. While the men at first were preoccupied in a hot pursuit, high-stakes game of poker, it was the ladies, eager to make themselves more comfortable in their erotic orgy with one another. Besides, as far as the other ladies were concerned, Graceland had enough dick for all of them, without the assistance of their husbands. Things was definitely steamy, hot and heavy by the end of the guys' games, and they finally realized what was happening. It wasn't long before they got in where they could fit in, frequently swapping wives. Nevertheless, the group of them weren't at all discreet about what they were doing, so the moans and the groans lingered loud enough for anyone walking by the lounge to hear. The teenagers laughed aloud as they munched on popcorn while enjoying their movie. By the ending credits of the film, feeling anxious, two of the teen siblings went to find their dad to ask him for more cocaine, as by now the two were fiending. While walking the halls of the mansion, peering in and out of different rooms, looking for their parents, they ran into Nanny Mary, whom asked them if they were okay. "Yeah, fine," they replied. "Just looking for my dad," 16-year-old Sammy said. Mary responded, "They're in the lounge." But of course, she also added she didn't think that they should go in there. The pair walked off and shouted, "Oh, it's okay. We've seen it all before. Thanks." Mary shook her head and went about her business. When Sammy and his sister Sarah reached the lounge, they didn't bother knocking and walked right on in. Plenty of drugs, alcohol, and other paraphernalia was sprawled about, so the teens helped themselves. Sarah got Sammy's attention and said, "Hey, look, check it out." The teens giggled and pulled out their phones to record as they watched the group of the parents get it on. Sammy was shocked to see Graceland had a penis and laughed loud enough to get everyone's attention. Sammy's dad got up butt naked, dick slanging, as he walked out the glass room. Not at all mad, Sammy's dad, "Samuel, say hey, what's so funny, boy?" as he grabbed him by the neck and pulled him in for a sweaty hug. Sammy and Sarah both replied, "Oh, nothing. We just wanted some coke." Samuel responded, "Oh, well, y'all acted like y'all seen something you liked. The coke is on the table." Sarah said, "Yeah, we seen it." But yet and still, with a grin on his face, Sammy asked his dad how Graceland had a penis. Samuel laughed aloud as he took a shot and said, "Oh, I see. So that's what you were looking at, huh?" Well, that's a long, long story, son, he joked as he looked down and snorted him a line of coke himself. Well, I be damned. Looks like your Peter is talking, boy, Samuel shouted. Sammy had a hard on, and his dad suggested, why don't you come on and join us since you're so interested? Besides, your mom would be proud of you. Sammy smiled. Yeah, okay, eager to follow his dad's lead. Sammy's father, Samuel, turned him out when he was just a boy, and Sammy's mom, Karen, had been sexually involved with him since before puberty. Sarah got the same treatment, but she was far more interested in getting high at the moment. Samuel and his son eagerly rejoined the orgy, and the other parents were anxiously excited to include him. Sarah made her a hefty party pack and went to find the other teens, but she couldn't stay quiet about what she seen. Although used to being groomed, molested, and raped over her years, then learning it was a lot easier and less painful if she just sat back and at least pretended to enjoy it. But in all her 14 years, Sarah had never seen a transgender. Well, at least undressed and naked. So as soon as Sarah got back to the home theater room, she blurted out to Miraculous, "Hey, why didn't you tell me your mom had a dick?" Embarrassed and shocked, Sarah yelled out such a thing. She replied simply, "I don't know. Didn't really think it mattered." Sarah said, "Yeah, I guess not." But the other teens hysterically laughed and asked Sarah jokingly, "So how do you know? Did she show you or something?" Sarah said, "Hell no," while snorting her pack. "But I seen all of our parents in the lounge together, naked and having sex." The teens weren't surprised and said, "That figures." Miraculous by now was irritated. Over the years, she grew a prolonged hatred for her parents. They were always high, drunk, fighting, having some kind of sex party, or performing some kind of satanic ritual, and now she was embarrassed in front of her friends. It really didn't much matter though, because the teens there were used to abuse of all kinds since they were babies too. But not many people knew Graceland's little secret. Sandra asked Sarah, "Hey, where is your brother?" And Sarah replied casually, "He stayed to have fun with our dad." Okay, Miraculous thought, it's getting late. So she suggested to the others that they try to sneak upstairs before their parents all attempted to force them to join in too. Everyone agreed, but a few of the older teens wanted to stop at the lounge and the bar to grab more drugs and booze to drink. The other 16 hurried up the spiral stairs to Miraculous' huge, luxurious room, and the three others pranced their way to the lounge. Once inside, they grabbed what they could to feed their addictive habits. Sandra, Sarah, and Myron were stopped abruptly before they could jolt out the door. It was Sarah's totally wasted mom, Jennifer, whom stopped the group, slurring her words with her eyes barely open. She said, "I know you guys didn't think you were going to get out of here without giving mommy a kiss goodnight." Extremely grossed out because Jennifer had dried cum all over her face, the teens looked at each other and asked, "Do we have a choice?" Jennifer shouted, "Hell no. Now come on before I tell your dads." The teen said fine and kissed Jennifer goodnight and got the hell up out of there as fast as they could. Not far behind them was Sammy, whom seemed pretty damn happy he got his rocks off by miraculous mom Graceland. Sammy was one of the weird few who got off on and enjoyed what was actually abuse. Sarah told him all the time, "Ugh, you're just like Dad." Every time he crept in her room late at night, back up the stairs in Miraculous' room, they all snuggled up in their own comfy sleeping bags and pallets Nanny Mary made them while sharing their childhood horror stories with each other. Wow, what a way to end my birthday, Miraculous thought, as she announced she had a pounding headache. Mitchell all of a sudden, and all too quickly, offered Miraculous a strange-looking pill, saying, "Here, take this." So Miraculous did, not wanting to disturb her nanny, but it wasn't long before that little pill knocked Miraculous plumb out. The boys, Arlen, Mitchell, Sammy, Marlon, and Billy, tipsy and high as a kite, thought it would be funny to play a prank on Miraculous. The girls, Sarah, Sandra, Daisy, and Tabitha, didn't think that was a good idea since she didn't feel so well. "Y'all are no damn fun," the boys said. "I'll show you fun," 15-year-old Daisy said to 16-year-old Myron. Daisy stripped in front of everyone and started making out with Myron. The rest of the group laughed hysterically as they watched until Sammy suggested it would be a good idea to mess with Miraculous yet again. The teens, obviously overly intoxicated, made the decision to record themselves stripping and taking advantage of poor sleeping Miraculous. Clearly, the bad judgment of the teens stemmed from each of their years of sexual abuse. They were the abusers, and highly promiscuous too. When the teenagers' hanky-panky was over and done, they passed out into a stupor until morning. Mary entered the room bright and early at 9 a.m. the next day to awaken the teens for breakfast. The room was a mess, and none of the teens were dressed, sprawled about in nothing but their underwear. It was no wonder to Nanny Mary what had happened, but Miraculous jumped up, asking anxiously what was going on because she couldn't remember anything. Ashamed, Miraculous stormed to her bathroom to get dressed and had an extreme attitude the rest of the day. Everyone else got up and went about their own way. The guests grabbed their breakfast to go and went about their day with their parents, who waited for them in the billiard room of the mansion until they departed in their own separate luxury vehicles and limousines. Between the ages of 15 and 20 years old, the estranged twins would soon face a catastrophic event that would greatly affect them both, as the identical pair grew from young girls to young ladies. A twintacular tower was bound to collapse, which would change everything forever, but bring the twin sisters back together. Twin 1. Epiphany and her mother continued to have beef. It seemed the older Epiphany got, the more severe the abuse she had to endure. That is until she was 16 years old and kicked out on the street because she came across some information she wasn't supposed to see. Epiphanies overheard Rachel Lawson talking to her boyfriend about the money she was receiving for her. Intrigued by the matter because she never had a father, Epiphany wondered who Rachel was getting the money from. So she began digging around, searching and looking whenever Rachel and her scumbag rapist boyfriends wasn't around. And one day, Epiphany found a box full of documents and proof Rachel planned on using to expose Millard and Graceland Devlin. Epiphany couldn't believe her eyes. Not only was she supposed to be the child of a wealthy couple, but she had a twin. Epiphany grew angrier and angrier the more she thought about all the years of abuse she suffered at the hands of Mommy Monster and her Freddy Krueger boyfriends, not to mention all the money she had received and almost never bought Epiphany anything, something she was bullied for in school. By now, Epiphany was a ticking time bomb waiting to explode. She stole the box of documents and buried it to obtain a later because Epiphany decided she was going to expose them all for what they had done and all of her pain and suffering. So when Rachel Lawson got home drunk as a skunk, as always, Epiphany confronted her with the cold hard truth she had hidden from her, and Rachel lost it and immediately began to attack Epiphany. Rachel and Epiphany fought, but Epiphany wasn't going to take not one more lick. She knew everything as she screamed at Rachel about the blackmail, the money, the contract, the deal she made with the government, and about her twin. Furious, Rachel threw Epiphany out for good, and they never seen each other again. 1 week after the incident, Rachel Lawson was shot and killed in cold blood in broad daylight while she was at the bank. Sources say that it was a bank robbery attempt, but Rachel was the only person injured and killed. It was obvious that it was a hit and a staged event set up by Mr. Devlin and the government. Epiphany had a hard knock life, but she was able to manage on her own. Already a rebel, Epiphany became a truther and whistleblower and took to her social media account to expose every dirty detail of her life. Of course, people doubted Epiphany, but she didn't care. No one knew she had all the evidence and proof, and because of that, the Devlins denied the accusations altogether, and Epiphany became a targeted individual. The United States government tried to make Epiphany's life a living hell, as if she hadn't already been through enough. They even tried to make Epiphany seem crazy, so no one would believe her. She started being cyberbullied, gang-stalked, harassed, and even threatened. So Epiphany made copies of all the evidence, posted it online, and sent it to the media in her town, as well as where the Devlins resided in California. Epiphany was homeless for 4 years, and during those years, she saved every dime she could to take a train to California. But something big was about to happen poor Epiphany didn't see coming. Twin 2. Miraculous, already earning her superstar status, continued on to becoming the most popular celebrity within her age group. With non-stop modeling, fashion shows, and acting roles, Miraculous was often busy and booked, something in which caused tensions to flare as Miraculous and her mother Graceland often bumped heads. Graceland was obviously jealous of Miraculous, her beauty, popularity, and by now, Miraculous actually made more money than Graceland, causing Graceland to hate her own daughter, especially since even her husband Millard's attention was on his favorite girl, Miraculous, as he called her. This was even more infuriating to Graceland because Miraculous was born a girl. Millard no longer desired Graceland sexually and openly flaunted a sexual relationship and close bond with his own daughter, Miraculous, not to mention his many other affairs with both men and women. As a result of this, Graceland was always high, drunk, and bloody mad. So much so, she snapped at everyone daily. Miraculous, Millard, the nanny, mansion staff, and any and everyone in between. But lately, even Miraculous was aggressively angry. Because since 16 years old, Miraculous was aware she had a twin. She couldn't believe her parents would abandon her, and now the family stayed in the tabloids as Hollywood's wildest scandal. Miraculous even had to work extra hard for the directors, producers, executives, etc., because they always gave her a hard time in this lecture about the matter, saying that they were risking their careers keeping her at the top of the charts as a A-list celebrity. So of course, behind the scenes, Miraculous always found her way to someone's casting couch and doing dirty little favors for freaks who made her pay for her parents' mistakes, often complaining to Daddy Devlin, whom assured Miraculous he'd handled everything soon enough and all would be fine. Not sure what he meant by that, Miraculous figured it wasn't anything good and feared for her twin sister's life. Millard Devlin. While Millard was happy not to be funneling out any more money to now deceased Rachel Lawson, he still had a problem he wanted taken care of immediately. He wanted Epiphany found and abducted to be sex trafficked for all the inconvenience. Once again, Millard hired his private investigator to locate Epiphany, who moved frequently since she was homeless. His CIA contacts had a track, trace, and hack team on her also. When the time was right, Millard told his traffickers to bring Epiphany to him first, unharmed, and he was offering $100,000 apiece for each of his helpers for her safe recovery. And of course, just like that, Mr. Devlin's foot soldiers were on a mission. Mr. Devlin also contributed $500,000 to both the CIA and FBI contacts that he had. Graceland Devlin. Queen bitch as always, just couldn't keep her nose clean. On a cocaine meth binge, Graceland hadn't ate or slept in days. Every other day, re-upping supplies, Graceland was on a downward spiral out of control. With her career and marriage basically over, Graceland didn't even give a damn about her appearance anymore, as she spent her fortune on drugs, alcohol, pills, and marijuana. I suppose she had to stay under the influence to cope with watching her husband get out of bed with her to creep into her daughter's room every night. The Hunt. Mr. Millard Devlin's private investigator, Mitch Slum, was on an assignment following Epiphany. Mitch kept the human traffickers up to date on her location as they were en route to Nashville, Tennessee, to fulfill the overall mission. Mr. Devlin's CIA contacts kept track of all parties involved as they were surveillance 24 hours a day, 7 days a week by the government agent in the top secret mission Operation Twin Flame. Showtime. February 20th, 2021 at 11:11 p.m. Epiphany exited her job at Hurt's Donuts coffee shop and proceeded to walk to her hotel room, which was only about 4 blocks away. Preoccupied on her phone while she walked, Epiphany wasn't as attentive to her surroundings as she normally would be. Almost there, with only 2 blocks left to go, Epiphany stopped at the crosswalk as passing cars drove by on their green light. Although in a high volume area, traffic was light and the town was eerily silent. But regardless to how strange the night felt, Epiphany went on to hurry to get to her room as fast as possible. But just as she stepped off the curb, speeding out the alleyway was a black, unmarked van. Thinking it was just some drunk driver, Epiphany stopped in her tracks to avoid the vehicle. But just as Epiphany stopped, so did the van, and all of a sudden, the doors of the van flew open, and 2 men jumped out and grabbed Epiphany and threw her in the back of the van as the driver sped away frantically. Epiphany screamed, kicked, and fought with every bit of energy that she had, even taking a bite of the finger of one of the traffickers, whom abruptly backslapped her. Before Epiphany could arise again, the other trafficker jabbed Epiphany with a needle that caused her to black out. The men kept Epiphany drugged continuously during the entire trip, as well had her wrists and ankles bound together by zip ties and a hood draped over her head. The trip was 2,011 miles and 29 hours long of a drive. Poor Epiphany had no escape and no idea where she was going or what was to happen next. But the traffickers and Epiphany were on their way to Hollywood, California. Operation Twin Flame mission complete. On the night Epiphany was abducted, things seemed so eerily strange and quiet because the CIA, Black Ops, and the FBI, Eagle Eye, had agents out staging the event. For the exception of very few cars, traffic was blocked on certain streets surrounding the target area. Millard Devlin communicated directly on the regular with all of his contacts. At 11:22 p.m. on 2/20, Millard received 2 calls, one from government agents, which relayed the messages plain and simple, Operation Twin Flame, green light. And the second call was from Millard's private investigator, who reported mission complete. Mitch Slum was directed to trail the traffickers to make sure they followed his strict orders precisely, and they'd be paid in full upon arrival. Family Affair. February 22nd, 2021. Mr. Millard Devlin ordered the mansion staff to prepare for a special occasion. Cook Sandy Mitchell was directed to prepare a feast. Housekeepers Dorothy Ann and Rosa Lee were instructed to organize the grand dining room. Nanny Mary Jonas, whom wasn't a nanny anymore for now grown Miraculous, but was yet and still her personal assistant, was told to see to it that Miraculous Other engagements were canceled, and she was made glamorous for the evening's event. As well, she would be required to care for a new guest. Miraculous was requested to be present for a special surprise. Graceland was scalded by Millard to clean up her act for a while and prepare for the shock of her life. But Graceland stopped taking orders from Millard long ago, so she wasn't interested in his theatrics, but would be in attendance anyway just for the hell of it and to see what was going on. 4 p.m. 2/22/21. And the traffickers finally arrived and entered the gates slowly of the Devlin's estate, the private investigator lagging in tow behind them. All four men greeted Millard at the front lawn. With Epiphany still drugged and asleep in the van, the gentlemen entered the mansion through the foyer and proceeded to Millard Devlin's office. As prearranged, Millard paid the three traffickers and the private investigators $100,000 apiece for their services. Millard also made reference to needing the traffickers again on a later date, which he'd be in touch with them about at that time. The men shook hands and went to retrieve Epiphany to bring her inside. The private investigator didn't want any other affiliation with what would happen to the girl next, so Mitch Slum was all too eager to get the heck out of Dodge as fast as possible. The traffickers removed a drugged and dazed Epiphany from the van and carried her inside and to an assigned guest room Millard already had ready for her. Upon entering the room, the men laid Epiphany on the bed and placed shackles and handcuffs on her to keep her bound to the bed. As the men left, the room was locked from the outside and Millard escorted the men out. The family were all preoccupied, so no one knew just yet what had just occurred. Mr. Devlin called for Mary to come to his office at once over the speakerphone. Mary was at the guest house with Miraculous, which is where she decided to live after her 18th birthday. But as ordered, she promptly hurried to see what Mr. Devlin wanted so urgently. Upon arriving back inside the mansion, Mary quickly went to his office and knocked gently on the door. As she entered, "Come on in and sit down," Millard said. Hoping this wasn't another of Mr. Devlin's sexual propositions, she did as she was told. Millard then said, "Well, Mary, our special guests have arrived, and you're to take care of her needs just as you have for Miraculous until further notice." Confused, Mary asked whom was the guest, because she was never required to tend to guests before. Millard simply replied, "You'll soon find out. Now I want you to bathe her, dress her, comb her hair, and have her ready for dinner by 6 p.m. "Okay," Mary said. "Oh, and another thing. She is to stay locked in her room unless I otherwise say so." "You got that?" Millard shouted. Mary hung her head and said, "Yes, sir." But she was frightened at what she found in the locked room. Millard had never bring one of his human trafficked victims home before, at least not inside the mansion. Not since Mary had been there when he abducted and trafficked her 19 years ago. Mr. Devlin handed Mary the key to the room and to the shackles of the handcuffs, then told Mary to get out and go hurry up and make the girl presentable. Mary did as she was told, but was stopped by Graceland in the hall, whom was scummy drunk. Graceland yelled at Mary, "What the hell is going on?" Mary replied, "I'm sorry, ma'am, but you'll have to ask Mr. Devlin." Mary went about her business and ran as fast as she could up the spiral stairs. She fumbled the keys about in her hands as she began to sweat. Finally, Mary opened the door, slamming it shut behind her, and she fell to her knees. Mary couldn't believe what her eyes were seeing. The dirty, drugged girl chained to the bed looked identical to Miraculous. Tears rolled down Mary's face as she unchained the poor girl, whom barely seemed to be alive. Mary only had an hour and a half until dinner, so she had to set her feelings aside and hurry up, because if she was late, Mr. Devlin would likely beat them both. Mary ran the young lady a bath while she desperately tried to wake her. "What's your name, honey?" Mary asked her repeatedly. When finally she spake, "Epiphany." "Wow, an epiphany you are indeed," Mary said while undressing her. When she noticed Epiphany was surely a girl, but had both male and female genitalia. Not quite like Graceland, because Epiphany was born this way. She wondered if Mr. Devlin knew. Nevertheless, she helped Epiphany to the tub to soak while she found her something nice to wear for dinner. Groggy but awake, Epiphany asked Mary, "Where am I?" Mary replied, "You'll find out soon, hon. You'll find out soon enough. And you will most definitely be surprised." Strangely, Epiphany was rather calm, feeling a bit weak. She didn't have much fight left in her. Mary finished helping Epiphany bathe, dress, and styling her hair. Epiphany, however, had never been catered to in such a way. She never had on such expensive clothes, shoes, and jewelry, nor her hair ever styled so nicely. It almost felt fairy tale-ish to her, if it wasn't for the fact she had just been abducted, drugged, and trafficked. Mary told Epiphany, "Whatever you do, for your safety, don't make Mr. or Mrs. Devlin angry." Epiphany shouted, "What? Do you mean to tell me I'm in California?" And Mary said, "Yes. So I'm here in the mansion of the parents that gave me up?" Once again, Mary responded, "Yes. So are you saying Mr. Devlin had me kidnapped?" Epiphany said, while pacing the floor. "I believe so, hon," Mary replied. "So who are you?" Epiphany asked, so confused. "I'm the nanny," Mary Jonas said. "I took care of your sister since she was a baby." "Wow," Epiphany said, as she fell to the vanity stool to sit a spell. "Dinner is at 6 p.m., so you'll meet everyone then," Mary said, while doing Epiphany's makeup. "I've never had makeup before," Epiphany said. "Who knew I could look so beautifully glamorous?" she thought aloud. "I really hate you had to come here under such horrific circumstances," Mary mumbled. "I too was lured here, something like the way you were." "That's horrible," Epiphany said. Mary warned Epiphany, "Be very careful." As the clock struck 6, the Devlins are evil, dangerous people who do awful things. "Thanks. I'll remember that," Epiphany said. Family reunion. At 6 p.m., a loud chime rang through the entire mansion. The alert signaled for dinner. The Devlin family proceeded to the grand dining room promptly. Millard, Graceland, and Miraculous eagerly sat down, waiting on Mary to enter with their special guest. Mr. Devlin grew impatient immediately and shouted, "Where the hell is that cunt?" Mrs. Devlin said, all of a sudden, "Oh, shut the hell up, Millard. She's coming." Miraculous interrupted and responded, "Yeah, Dad, don't call her that." Just then, Mary walked in the room with their special guest in tow. Miraculous and Graceland sat in shock, eyes bucked wide open and mouth gapped open as well, as they laid eyes on Epiphany for the first time. They couldn't believe just how identical Epiphany and Miraculous looked. Graceland's voice shook as she spake aloud to Millard, asking him, did he kidnap Epiphany to bring her there? Millard responded arrogantly, "Of course I did. This twin devil is the cause of all the scandals we're dealing with. She's just as bad as that Rachel Lawson bitch." Epiphany screamed, "To hell with you, bastard! You have no idea what I've went through. But from the looks of it, you're way worse than all of my so-called mother's boyfriends who fucked me every chance they got." Graceland giggled. "Well, Millard ain't much better, honey. But at least after he fuck you, he'll give you a lot of money." "What the fuck, Mom? Really?" Miraculous screamed. Miraculous got up to hug her sister as Millard laughed hysterically. "Well then, young lady. Great. So you've already been broken in, huh?" he said. "Now shut up and eat your damn food so you can go back to your room." "You should be glad I even allowed you to come here," Millard yelled frantically across the room. "But don't get comfortable. It won't be for long." Miraculous cried out, "Dad, that isn't right. What are you going to do to her?" Graceland curiously replied, "Yeah, Millard, what are you planning in that psycho mind of yours?" As she laughed aloud. Millard paused and looked at Grayson, and then slapped her across her face. "Don't you dare speak to me like that in front of the girls," he said. Graceland jumped up, threw her martini in Millard's face, and grabbed her steak knife and told Millard if he touched her again, she'd kill him. Then she stormed off to retreat to her powder room. Millard ordered Mary to take the girl back to her room and lock the damn door. Miraculous said no, she can stay at the guest house with me. Millard shouted, "Absolutely not. And if you make a big deal about it, I'll make her disappear tonight." Epiphany sighed. "Just great. That's just my damn luck. Go from one bad situation to worse. Thanks for nothing, Mr. Devlin." Mary did as she was told and escorted both the twins out of the dining room. Miraculous walked with Epiphany to her room as she apologized to her. Epiphany told Miraculous not to worry about it because it wasn't her fault. Mary and Miraculous stayed with Epiphany for a while, and the three of them shared their horror stories with each other. It was amazing how the twins experienced similar things, including childhood trauma and abuse. Frightened by a knock at the door, Graceland demanded to be let in at once. Mary opened the door for Graceland, and she walked in staggering about. Tipsy as always and smoking her weed, Graceland looked around the room and seeing the shackles and bondage ties on the bed. Then she said, "Well, looks like old Millard is still up to the same old kinks," as she passed the blunt to Miraculous, whom hid it and passed it around the room to the others. Mary spake up and asked Graceland and Miraculous if they were aware of Epiphany's birth defects. Confused, the two asked Epiphany what was Mary talking about. Epiphany sighed and said, "It's really not that big of a damn deal." As she stood up, raised up her dress, and pulled down her underwear, Graceland gasped. "Well, I be damned, girl." Unaware, Epiphany was born like that because she was taken away immediately after she was born. Miraculous was wild and didn't know such a thing was even possible. Graceland was born male and then transformed, but none of them had ever seen a natural born hermaphrodite before. It was ironic, but it seemed Graceland took an instant liking to Epiphany, more so than Miraculous, whom she had been around all her life. Graceland shared herself with Epiphany, and she could not believe her eyes. Epiphany all of a sudden said, "So you're really naturally born a man?" Graceland said, "Yep." And Epiphany replied, "Wow, you rich people have all kinds of dirty little secrets, huh?" Graceland responded with a sneaky grin, "Oh, baby, you have no idea." The women continued bonding. Then Graceland said to Mary, "Get the girls ready." Mary replied, "For what, miss?" Graceland said, "To hell with Millard. We're going to have a girls' night." Miraculous, surprised, said, "Really?" Graceland never wanted to do a girls' night with her, like ever. Now, all of a sudden, Epiphany shows up and has a dick and she wants to have a girls' night? Miraculous said, "Whatever." Graceland proceeded to leave the room and told the girls to meet her out by the pool in an hour. As Graceland walked out the room, she ran into Millard, who immediately snapped, saying, "Whatever you and those girls got going, don't get too comfortable because Epiphany won't be here very long because I'm going to put her ass to work to replace all the money that tramp swindled out of me." Graceland rolled her eyes and snapped back at Millard, "Oh, really? So now you're going to pimp out the daughter we abandoned, huh? Just great, Millard. You're a real fucking scumbag. But tell me something. Did you know Epiphany was born with both male and female genitalia?" Millard yelled, "What the hell did you say?" "You heard me, jackass. Epiphany was naturally born a hermaphrodite. And the hospital didn't tell us because you were so upset about not getting a son that you refused to see the other child and agreed to keep only one," Graceland explained. "Now look what you've done." Although shocked, Miller had made up his mind. He already planned to groom her into a sex slave and pimp her out secretly to his counterparts. Millard's criminal mind wondered. Now he could make even more money than he thought, fulfilling the freaky fetishes of wealthy elite socialites. $1 million business proposition in the making. Yeah, maybe he would keep Epiphany around, Millard told Graceland his plan. Epiphany could stay under one condition. She had to be under MK Ultra mind control and programmed as a sex slave. Graceland responded, "Whatever," as she walked away and Millard went to make some important phone calls to some very powerful people. Miraculous, Epiphany, and Mary put on swimming suits and readied themselves for the girls' night pool party. Graceland laid on the patio deck with all her favorite party favors and cocktails, as always, waiting for the girls to come down and join her. It wasn't much longer before the group of them gathered together. Graceland had each of them to take what she called a happy pill. Without the option to refuse, the young women, twins, and Mary did as they were told. Graceland wasn't one for biting her tongue, so she spake frankly to them about Millard's plans. Epiphany could stay only by Millard's strict conditions. Appalled about the matter, Miraculous insisted that was ridiculous. With the happy pill kicking in, Epiphany said, "What other choice do I have besides death?" The twins took a shot of liquor and hopped in the pool. They huddled up together, conjoined at the hip, and whispered amongst each other. Miraculous told Epiphany they were going to think of something because she wasn't going to allow her parents to hurt her anymore or get rid of her again. All the women partied together through the night. Graceland even convinced them to indulge with her in a little no sugar. Millard contacted some very prominent individuals in power at a secret lab who he invited over for drinks and to handle some business. Around 11 p.m., Dr. Vincent Boddard and Dr. Annabelle Griffin arrived at the Devlin's mansion. Mr. Devlin escorted the doctors to the lounge bar where he turned on a in-house monitor surveillance system to show them Epiphany. The doctors were quite surprised that the girls were identical twins, and you couldn't really tell them apart, for the exception of the difference between their legs. Nevertheless, Millard Devlin invited the two doctors over to start the mind control programming on Epiphany, which they agreed to do for a small fee, of course. Mr. Devlin called Mary over the speakerphone and instructed her to return Epiphany to her room right away and leave her there until further notice. Miraculous insisted she go with Epiphany, but Millard refused to permit her to do so. Mary did as she was told and escorted Epiphany to her room. Epiphany was chained and tied to the bed once again, and Mary proceeded to leave, locking the door behind her, telling Epiphany try not to be afraid or fight back because it would make things worse as she left. Miraculous, angry, approached her father and demanded to know what he was about to do. Millard excused himself from the doctors as he forced Miraculous to leave. Miraculous stormed off furious, and Mary hurried to go console her as they walked across the lawn to the guest house. Graceland relocated to her personal den to relax and continue in her habits as always. Mr. Devlin then led the way for the doctors to the bedroom suite Epiphany was waiting in. Millard used his spare key to unlock the door and let the doctors in, whom started their vigorous process right away. Mr. Devlin told the doctors he'd be in his office if they needed anything. Over several hours through the night, the doctors did a multitude of different things to Epiphany, starting with giving her a mind-altering drug through IV. Epiphany was then connected to a advanced electromagnetic machinery which attached a wiring to her temples and different areas around her head. Her eyelids were clamped, forcing them open, with an artificial intelligent device lowered over her eyes that projected rapid images repeatedly. Another device was used to implant sounds and phrases through Epiphany's ear, which programmed her subconscious with particular phrases, statements, sexual explicit demands, and trigger words. Epiphany was placed under MK Ultra mind control, which made her highly triggerable. Beta sex kitten programming, as well as monarch programming, was also introduced to Epiphany over a period of time. Due to Epiphany's already being chipped, the programming was fairly easy because she is already highly suggestible due to the childhood trauma and abuse. Just as miraculous had been done, altars were created to access certain programming within her. The initial process was finally complete around 3:30 a.m., but further programming would be conducted later at the lab. Epiphany was left in traumatic shock after the whole ordeal she had just experienced. The doctors collected their tools and equipment and proceeded to exit the room and downstairs to alert Millard Devlin they were finished for now. However, reminding him Epiphany needed to be kept under heavy mind-altering medications until all the programming was complete, in which they provided Millard with a bottle of pills for Epiphany's first month's supply. Millard thanked the doctors for their services and walked with them to the front door, then watched as they exited the property. As Millard turned around, there stood Miraculous, whom was severely upset with her dad. Before Millard could say a word, Miraculous stormed off and upstairs. Miraculous snuck the key from Mary and went to see her twin sister. When she entered the room, Epiphany was still chained and tied to her bed, naked and in a daze and nonverbal after what she had just endured. Miraculous didn't have the key for the shackles, so she covered Epiphany up and laid on the bed next to her, turned on the TV, and laid there until she fell asleep. 6 a.m. Still wide awake on a bender, Graceland watched from a distance as her husband Millard sneakily snuck up the stairs and into the room with the twins. She knew all too well that the evil, devilish thoughts running through Millard's mind as the sinister sexual predator he was. Inhibited and unable to change his dirty, rotten mind, Graceland retreated to her master bedroom she no longer shared with her husband. Miraculous was used to being awakened in the middle of the night, so she was alerted and aware as to whom was creeping in the room with access to Miraculous programming. It wasn't long before he was able to trigger her back to a childlike state of mind, obeying her father's every sick, twisted command. But on this day, in the wee hours of the morning, Millard Devlin sexually assaulted both twins together. The physical, mental, emotional, and sexual abuse continued over and over again. Mr. Millard Devlin even went as far as pimping the twins out to his wealthy, prominent friends. Unlike Miraculous, however, with no formal training or advanced education, Epiphany was used as a high-priced, mind-controlled sex slave only. Epiphany was forced to service the rich and famous, celebrities, high-profile, government officials, millionaires, billionaires, and even trillionaire patrons. Porn videos were created of the twins together, and often they were expected to have sexual relations with each other. The twins were forced to participate in snuff films, which included the torture and murder of children, as well as satanic rituals and animal sacrifices. The twins were initiated into a satanic cult witch coven as well. Epiphany did eventually begin to work with her sister Miraculous, and they traveled everywhere together. Because between gigs, the twins made the bulk of their fortune from prostitution. However, an opportunity did present itself when a producer approached the twins about an idea for their own show. The twins' 20th birthday came and went. For the first time in their life, they got to celebrate together, which they enjoyed to the fullest. However, the twins continued to play their respected roles as the wealthiest elite twins in the business. But the girls made a twin pact that no one but them knew about. Something they actually only spake about in secret twin witch language no one else could understand. Nevertheless, the twins decided that their 21st birthday would be the biggest bang Hollywood had ever seen. And the girls sealed the deal with a sacred satanic blood oath. The Devlins had no idea, after years of torture, just what kind of twin tower disaster they had created and was about to collapse. The twins had endured a lot, but they had enough when they started being used to traffic children underground. Twin Tower finale. It had been a year and 5 months since Epiphany had been viciously abducted and trafficked to Hollywood, California, then dropped off like leftovers to the Devlin's billionaire estate. Re-traumatized all over again, side by side with her identical twin, Miraculous, the dynamic duo had reached their 21st birthday. And as planned, the young women vowed to make this a event to remember forever. Unbeknownst to Mr. and Mrs. Devlin, the Devlin twins had a massive celebration underway for their special day, a grand party with hundreds of guests attending for the live concerts of celebrity performers, free food, fun, endless open bars, and party favors. After the engagement, the twins had a prearranged plans to vacation at a private island resort. As for everything that was anything pertaining to gatherings or get-togethers at the Devlin's mansion, the setup, decorations, and festivities have to be immaculate and of utmost perfection. Therefore, the party planners, deco designers, stage setup crew, lighting and sound check guys, caterers, etc., spent the early part of the day setting up the event. Miraculous, Epiphany, and Mary packed their luggages for their trip after the party. Then the women spent the rest of the afternoon preparing and readying themselves for the twins' birthday extravaganza. But of course, the event was rather costly, especially after fulfilling all the demands of the spoiled twins. Therefore, the get-together cost roughly $11 million. Mr. and Mrs. Devlin, of course, was always up for some excitement, especially at the expense of the twins. So they were their bubbly, gullible selves as always, and completely off guard as to what the night would hold. It was no secret the Devlin's marriage is practically over, but they continued to put up a good front around others. However, for good reason, Epiphany and Miraculous hated their evil parents, whom were wicked to the core. The twins desired to rid themselves from the torturous horror of their demonic mother and father in an effort to free themselves of the abusive hold they had on them, and perhaps they'll get their chance soon enough if they're lucky. July 7th, 2022 at 7 p.m. The twins' birthday bash began. The who's who of the rich and famous and celebrity elite flocked to the enormous Devlin estate to party. 3 live concerts by A-list celebrity performers were amongst the various different things available to do. Guests filled the entirety of the mansion inside and out, with partygoers lounging in the hot tub, jacuzzi, splish splashing in the swimming pool, shooting pool in the billiard room, enjoying exotic dancers of male and female strippers, gaming in the game room, or hitting the dance floor. There was something to everybody's liking for everyone to do. And of course, the food, alcohol, and party favors of a variety of drugs were nonstop all through the night, keeping each and every guest full and satisfied. Miraculous and Epiphany socialized, mixing and mingling throughout the crowd, turned up to the max all night long. Mr. and Mrs. Devlin entertained the older crowd of guests attending by overseeing the gambling taking place in the lounge gambling room. Poker and blackjack was but a couple of games available. In fact, Mr. Devlin actually had a mini in-house casino in the mansion. Totally illegal, of course, but Mr. Devlin is a multi-billionaire who gets what he wants. Besides, the casino was only available to very wealthy persons whom played and could afford very high stakes games. Nevertheless, the head banging party went on without a hitch and was a success. Epiphany, Miraculous, and all their invited guests partied like rock stars all night long. It wasn't until the next day and the wee hours of the morning when guests decided to leave. Those who had personal drivers departed around 4 a.m., whereas those who drove their own luxury vehicles themselves didn't leave until around 6 or 7 a.m. when they had a chance to sober up some. The Devlins had retreated to their quarters around 3 a.m. for rest, relaxation, and rejuvenation, if you will. So no one had seen them since then, and so far as anyone else knew, Epiphany and Miraculous, as well as their personal assistant, Mary Jonas, left the property around 4 a.m. for their private flight to an island resort for their birthday vacation. The mansion staff were left in charge of assisting the remaining guests and helping them out when they were ready to go. However, no one could have expected or imagined what was about to happen next. But it's definitely going to make breaking news and shock the world. By 7 a.m., all the invited party guests were gone, at which time the mansion staff began to do their rounds to cleaning up the property. As part of the maid's daily routine, Miss Dorothy Ann went to Mr. Devlin's master suite bedroom to give him his daily medication for high cholesterol. However, upon Dorothy entering the room, she dropped the tray she was carrying and began to scream to the top of her lungs. Around the same time, other screams could be heard across the mansion in Mrs. Devlin's luxurious grand bedroom suite also, as maid Rosalie went to leave the missus vitamins and juice on her vanity. The maids were in tears, ran from the rooms, meeting each other in the hall at the top of the spiral stairs to console one another as they both frantically tried to explain what was wrong to each other. As it seemed, both Mr. and Mrs. Devlin had been grossly butchered to death. Blood spatter was everywhere in each of the rooms, all over the floors, walls, bed, everywhere one could imagine. With Epiphany, Miraculous, and Mary gone on their trip, the mansion staff gathered together to figure out what to do next. The housekeepers, cook, and other staff on the property decided it'd be best to contact the family first because, with the Devlins being billionaires, when this got out to the public, it was going to be a huge scandal. So the chief staff called the twins to report what they had found. Still on their private flight to the island resort, when the twins answered, they acted shocked by the news as they played their role, ensuring the staff they would be on their way as soon as possible. They gave them the go-ahead to call the police for help. What they were unaware of is the Devlin twins already knew of their parents' demise well before they departed the estate for their trip. What really happened? Around 3 a.m., Epiphany and Miraculous slipped away from their massive party to carry out their plans. The girls met up with their once nanny, now personal assistant Mary, in the guest house of the mansion. What no one is aware of, not even the staff, is there is a secret underground tunnel and bunker that runs from the Devlin's mansion to the guest house underground. Something Mr. Devlin and his criminal counterparts used to traffic, hide out, and abuse kidnapped children. Nevertheless, Epiphany, Miraculous, and Mary waited until Mr. and Mrs. Devlin retreated to their separate rooms for the night. Then they traveled through the tunnel from the guest house to the mansion. The secret door is behind a bookshelf in Mr. Devlin's office, which is connected to a private elevator directly to his master bedroom, so the twins could navigate through the mansion without being seen. Once they reached Millard's room, it was no surprise he had taken up with one of the strippers, 19-year-old Samantha Clark. But Samantha was drugged and blacked out on the bed as Millard took advantage of her. The twins had enough of their dirty scumbag father, whom had abused them all the same way. When Miraculous, Epiphany, and Mary stormed the room from the secret entrance, the intoxicated bastard had the nerve to think that they had come to join his freak fest party. Epiphany raised the gun, aimed at Millard's head, but Millard was so high he began to laugh. Mary ran over to Samantha to help her up when she noticed the young girl was dead from an overdose. In a blind rage of fury, the three women attacked Millard. By the time they were done with him, Millard had been shot in the head, his throat was slit, his penis was cut off and placed in his mouth, and the old dirty bastard was stabbed 277 times. Of course, nobody heard a thing because the music and the crowd was so loud. Miraculous said, "One down and one to go," as the women stood there in their plastic disposable jumpers, booties, head covers, and gloves, covered in blood. They then entered their parents', his and her, bathroom that connected between each of their rooms. Graceland was entertaining some male company as well. Yet another of her playboys she paid for sexual favors. The twins waited and watched until Graceland was alone because they didn't want to kill an innocent person. Only their good for nothing parents. Graceland ordered the boy to give her fellatio, then forced herself on the boy as she brutally sodomized him from behind. After Graceland was done with him, even though he was bruised, bleeding, and hurt badly, she threw him a few $100s, then kicked him out of her room as she sat at her vanity to powder her nose some more. Miraculous, Epiphany, and Mary bursted through the room, catching Graceland off guard. Each of the women stabbed Graceland in the back for every time she did the same to them and allowed them to be repeatedly abused by Millard and many other men. Epiphany and Miraculous took their time mutilating and dismembering Graceland's body, using a machete to chop off every one of her body parts and subliminally rearranging them around the room, even cutting off her penis and throwing it in the trash, giving her the vagina she always wanted, but Millard refused to let her have. Finally, Epiphany, Miraculous, and Mary's job was done. They hurried back to the secret tunnel where they disposed of their jumpers, booties, head covers, gloves, and weapons. Then they went back to the guest house, cleaned up, changed clothes, and grabbed their luggage for their trip and left the Devlin estate unseen. Miraculous and Epiphany agreed to pay Mary $7 million for her pain and suffering she endured by their parents and for helping them eliminate the devilish Devlins. Also paying her a salary for staying on to work for the twins as their personal assistant. Meanwhile, the police, detectives, and media had swarmed the Devlin property. In no time at all, the coverage of the Devlin massacre was all over the news. Finally, the twins and their assistant Mary arrived back to the mansion and put on an act of a lifetime as distraught family members. Although there was suspicion, there was no evidence suggesting at all that the twins or their assistant Mary were involved or even at the mansion at the time Mr. and Mrs. Devlin's death. After all, the twins' guests all reported that they seen the Devlin twins leave for their trip to the island resort for a birthday vacation. Still to this day, it's a mystery as to whom murdered Millard and Graceland Devlin, or the deceased young lady found in Mr. Devlin's room. But Miraculous and Epiphany inherited $700 billion and were now the owners of the estate, businesses, and everything the Devlins owned. At which time, they took their trip to that private exotic island resort anyway and vacation for the remainder of their birthday getaway. The end.